The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest IGB webinar titled Esports in the Time of Coronavirus. I'm Hayden Williams, Senior Marketing Manager of IGB. This webinar is sponsored by Odin, who are an AI-powered automated live esports odds provider. And our moderator today is Ian Smith. Ian is Commissioner of the Esports Integrity Commission, and he'll introduce our panel of esports experts. Just some housekeeping. Please do send through your questions throughout the webinar. You can do so using the panel on the GoToWebinar page. And a quick reminder as well that this webinar will be recorded and will be ready to watch back within 24 hours. So without any more delay, over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Hayden. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon where we are. I suspect it's different times of day for all of you. It's wonderful to have a global audience, and thanks for being here. We have an amazing panel, so we're going to hear from them a lot more than from me, but I did want to, before I introduce each of them, just make the point that what we're really talking about today is esports and not gaming. This is a common misconception that people throw the whole idea of video gaming and esports into the same mix, and that is not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about esports as competitive video gaming, which tends to circle around 15 to 20 specific game titles, and you need to think of each of those as its own community, its own vertical, its own way of being in the competitive world, because the term esports is a little bit like saying the Olympics consisting of 25, 26 different events that have their own governing bodies, their own way of training, their own star athletes, and so on. Esports is exactly the same, and at the top of that pile we have three games that are very, very popular, which are Counter-Strike Global Offensive as a first-person shooter, and then two MOBAs that to the outsider might look very similar, which are Dota 2 and League of Legends, and creeping into that top tier would be Rainbow Six. And then we have a series of leagues down in the second tier, Overwatch League, the new Call of Duty League, and various other games as you go down into smaller and smaller communities. And that's really what we're talking about. And we're talking about it from a betting, gaming, integrity, gambling perspective, primarily today. And we're looking at really what's happened since coronavirus, since COVID-19, what's changed. So there may be terminology we use here because everybody involved on the panel is an expert and really embedded in the esports scene. And that means we may use terminology and say things that are unfamiliar to you. So please make use of the question bar there on, I think it'll probably be on your left as you look at your screen. And I'll do my best to answer those or to get them answered for you. So without further ado, in terms of hearing from me, I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'm going to ask each one of them just briefly to say what they do in esports, but also briefly how they came to be in esports in the first place, because it's one of those industries that has multiple entry points. It's very exciting. And I'm sure that there are some of you out there looking for your way into this industry, which is why perhaps you're on today's seminar. So I'm going to start off with Grant Johnson from Vi.gg. Grant?
Hi, Ian. Yeah, thanks for having me. My entry into esports was in 2014. I got invited to a StarCraft championship, and prior to going, I frankly had never even heard of StarCraft. My background was in traditional gambling. And when I went to it, what struck me was the energy level. It's a bit, first, if you haven't gone to one, when you first go to one, it's kind of like going to a combination rock concert, sporting event combined, because you got music and lasers and everything. And my takeaway at that time, I just felt I have to be involved in this because this is exciting. This is going to be huge. At that point in time, we formed, the company, which is now Esports Entertainment Group, and it took quite a while to test different gambling methodologies in the marketplace. As you know, Ian, because you and I have talked many times over the years, we tried to approach the market with a full-on bet exchange. The big handicap of the bet exchange is without liquidity, a bet exchange cannot work. And as you know, esports gambling is still fairly nascent. It's still fairly early days, even today. It's still fairly early days, and we just couldn't get the liquidity. So for those of you who have gone or seen buy.gg, our new launch platform has more variety in terms of, we have fixed odds, we have the pool betting, we have some exchange betting, pari-mutuel, etc., to give some options. And that seems to be tracking better. And because we're in the process of acquiring other traditional gambling operators and then adding esports into it, we've got some good feedback as to what's happening from the traditional sports books and where they're going with esports. Clearly, in the era of COVID, which we find ourselves in, everything that used to be currently doesn't matter because it's a whole new set of parameters and dynamics, and we have people coming in, as everybody in this panel knows, betting on esports, which 3 months ago never would have even watched anything esports wise. So there's a whole bunch of different variables here. The question we're all going to be challenged with is what we're seeing today, are we going to be able to hold on to and maintain post-COVID? What do those numbers look like? And I think that's probably where the greatest interest from the viewing audience is going to come from as well.
Thanks, Grant. And then from here in the UK and ESL, the world's largest esports tournament operator and organizer, James Dean. James?
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so I kind of naturally got into esports as effectively a gamer myself. I've never been good enough. That really was in parallel to what my career was, and that was very much, as we would call it, an endemic marketing play. So I was running a marketing agency that focused on gaming hardware, peripherals, lots of tech aspects. And the two things really converged. And in 2012, I opened the ESL UK franchise, which grew and grew over 88% every year on average for 5 years. And we got to a point where we then sold the franchise to Turtle Entertainment, as it was called at the time, who are ultimately owned by MTG. And really, my position is to grow esports on a local level in the UK specifically, and that's through two ways. One is to grow like a national level of competition and all the talent that comes with that, so the entire ecosystem, but also to bring big and larger events to the UK, so make the UK a most attractive proposition from a B2B level, ultimately leading into an increase in the overall esports ecosystem and business over here. And yeah, I've just thoroughly enjoy what I do. And the sort of projects that we work in and the stuff we get involved in is just incredible, and it's just great to see the ongoing growth. And of course, as just echoing what Grant just said, obviously how we've been able to pivot and carry on moving through these difficult times, but of course how that will then transition into new opportunities to consider what will kind of hang around once we get back to some state of normal, we hope.
Thanks, James. And then from Malta and the Maltese Gaming Authority, we have Antonio Zerafa. Antonio.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So basically, I represent the Malta Gaming Authority, the Maltese gambling regulator in Malta. I've been working at the authority for the past 5 years now. Obviously, as a regulator, we have always had a specific point of contact for us to liaise with sports governing bodies and other stakeholders in terms of assisting in safeguarding the integrity of sport. That includes esports also, of course. In fact, I believe we've had the MOU with you, Ian, as ESIC for a couple of years now. But I came into the esports or better yet the sports scene last year, because last year we realized that we need to have a specific and dedicated sports integrity unit, and not just an SPOC within the MGA. And that is sort of our way of saying that, listen, we intend to be more available to operators, more available to SGBs, in order for us to better assist in terms of betting data, in terms of match fixing investigations, etc., in order to be able to better assist all stakeholders. And in fact, in August 2019, I was tasked with the responsibility of managing the sports integrity unit. And I can say that since the announcement, since then, it has been extremely busy. And we've also obviously been busy with looking into cases of esports also. One of the things, in fact, which I would like to discuss today is the difference between esports and the other traditional sports, and how this difference also affected the way actually esports was affected by COVID-19. Because even there, with COVID-19, we have sort of came to the point that sort of esports was the only sport which was affected, and sometimes esports there was the tendency to put esports in sort of a bad light, which I do not think is fair, because there were other sports which were affected also due to COVID-19 in terms of integrity. But I am sure that we'll be able to go into that into much more detail as we go along.
Thanks very much. And then last, but by no means least, Marek Suchar from Odin, who's obviously, in addition to sponsoring today, also got a really interesting presentation for us. So Marek, once you've introduced yourself and your connection and introduction to esports, I'd invite you to continue straight into your presentation, and then we'll pick up the Q&A once you've finished.
Many thanks, Ian, for the introduction. I'm Marek Suchar, head of partnerships at Odin. When it comes to the original question, how I came into the esports, I was actually a gamer myself, as many of you. I started with multiple titles, but I somehow stuck with Dota, even before it was Dota 2 with the original Defense of the Asians. Then I followed all the TIs, all the teams. I followed CSGO as well. So when the time was right, roughly 3-4 years ago, I originally came from financial services industry, so I switched. And from then on, I am within esports and specifically betting vertical, which is definitely one of the fastest monetization verticals, I would say, within esports. So this is how I came to the industry, and hopefully we will have a new ways how the entire industry can benefit from our solutions. That being said, hopefully we can just really highlight some of the views of us on the industry. So when it comes to Odin, we are envisioning ourselves as the synonymous for engaging esports betting. Why is so? Is that right now, if we think about the esports and about millennials as a main target group for esports, many times what we see is that they consume the content on demand. When they want it, how they want it. If they want to watch a movie, they go to Netflix. If they want to hear certain songs, they go to Spotify. If they want to consume esports as such, they go to Twitch. And this is sort of standard for them. They do not want to wait. They do not want to make any issues around it, and no compromises. Nevertheless, if we look at esports betting, many times what we see on the market as a standard is that there are very few live markets, the uptime is extremely low, and many of the markets are actually slow-paced. What I mean by that is that if you think about your option to actually be able to bet only like half of the time, this is definitely on an engaging. Even if you are able to bet only on one market, while in the game you see there are multiple other things that you can bet on, this is again not engaging. So this way, the industry is limiting itself on the bets that takes long. There are not that many things to bet on. Many times they are limited to actually be able to make a bet. And even when the game is decided, again, there are no side markets. So this way, either a bookmaker or the industry itself limits it from the perspective of engagement, from the potential volume generation, which has eventually impact on the profit. Of course, we can do much better, increase the uptime, provide much more live markets that the punters can bet on, and even introduce fast-paced markets. So for example, for Counter-Strike, which are placed on rounds, and the winner rounds after reaching 16, there is a map winner. Map can take up to 40 minutes to be decided, while round can be decided in 3 to 4 minutes. So you can allow the punters to bet actually every 3 to 4 minutes instead of every 40 minutes, which definitely have the impact on engagement. There is much more opportunities that you can bet on and across the game as well. And even when the game is decided, you can still have side markets that you can actually bet on, which drives engagement, eventually has the impact on volume, and eventually leads to improved profitability. To use the example of this is the comparison of Odin solution against the regular provider. With us, many times we are looking at uptime higher than 80%, so almost across entire game, the punters can actually bet. While when we look at the industry standard, half of the time, the bettors actually cannot bet. Also, with our solution, we are looking, for example, in CSGO match at 34th minute mark. There are 50 options that the bettors can bet on, while on regular provider bookmaker, you can find up to 10. And of course, this has huge impact on the betting volume, on the engagement, and all the things I mentioned before. With that being said, as I mentioned, the challenges and the opportunities within the industry, let me introduce Odin. Odin is the technological company that focuses on engagement, which eventually drives profitability. With this being said, we are B2B esports odds suite and risk management provider. We are really focusing mainly on the engagement, on the uptime and number of live markets that I mentioned, because this way we are able to drive the volume, increase the margin, and eventually accelerate the profitability. With that being said, this would not be possible without the state-of-the-art technologies that we have in place, without machine learning techniques that we implemented, extremely experienced traders that we have, and the use of official data. When it comes to Odin, we combine more than 50 years of experience in betting and esports. Our team has actually expertise from being a market maker on Betfair Exchange. We and our solution have been extremely praised by Tipsport, which is one of the largest Central European bookmakers. And we have recently signed the conceptual agreement with Scientific Games, which saw the huge opportunity in esports as we've seen. And we are targeting both UK and US market to bring this new proposition to those markets together. With that being said, I'll jump into the topic that is in front of us, esports in times of COVID-19. As I would probably just visualize what Ian said already. When it comes to esports as competitive video gaming, there are a lot of titles, but not that many actually qualify for the mainstream, and many of them are actually niche esports. Some of those, and I guess we will touch that in the upcoming discussion, specifically sporting simulators, had some traction within the current crisis in the last couple of weeks, but it is highly questionable whether this success would actually prevail. Also, last but not least, there are titles that are in the mainstream for quite some time. They are being challenged, but at the same time, those challengers has fallen short so far. Similarly, what was addressed already, 95 to 99% of the volume generating in esports goes to three core titles: Counter-Strike, Dota 2, and League of Legends, with the exception of King of Glory for China and those sporting simulators we mentioned. So looking at this is the core where you want to look if you want to have a proper esports solution. And at the same time, one side note, when it comes to esports, similar to standard sports, 80% of the volume in betting happens in live. With that being said, this is again what I stressed a couple of times. We are speaking about the engagement for the live betting because majority of the value is actually in there. With that being said, I'm handing word back to you, Ian, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion.
Thanks very much, Marek. It's really interesting. And yeah, we'll definitely return to the discussion around sports simulators, I'm sure. But I'm going to ask James first, and this will be a question to each of you because you all bring different perspectives to this. But what has changed between January and today in the world of esports for you?
Well, the obvious thing, obviously, Ian, is the fact we can't have a physical event, and that happened in quite an interesting transitional period as one by one countries would basically close down and make some decisions. Some were in denial, some were trying to figure things out, some were pretending everything was normal. And as you mentioned earlier, around IEM, you know, we had players on site in Poland ready to go, and literally a decision was made just several days before the actual event to call the public attendance off, and it was quite close to actually cancelling the event entirely. So that was the first iteration, if you like, to basically transition online. Now, subsequently, we had ESL 1 LA scheduled. It was quite obvious that not only could we have a physical audience, but the players themselves were not going to be able to collate. And then, of course, there's also the production side of things. So the TV studio. And whether or not we could collate on-screen talent together. And the decision was made to run a TV studio, but to have the players operate at home. Now, the first response to this is actually entirely changing the tournament format. I don't think anyone in the industry would appreciate the fact that an event, if it could happen, would be cancelled entirely. A lot of stakeholders rely on these big events, not just ourselves as a company, but also our partners, our sponsors, the teams themselves, anyone providing services or any other business level activity around the event. So I think we wanted to really try our hardest to make it work. So the tournament format itself basically became one of, I suppose, an interesting opportunity, because when you're talking about several $100,000 in prize money, it's very rare to ever expect that tournament to be only happening online. So first of all, we have to consider about the integrity. And there's two aspects of that. First of all, I mean, one of the key reasons we had a physical finals in the first place as esports is that you have a level playing field. Everyone playing in that stadium is in the same environment on the same network with the same server. So all the latencies are very similar. They're the lowest as possible. You're able to control the playing environment. So there's no chance of physical aspects of cheating. So, looking at other people's screens or using a manipulated piece of hardware, keyboard or mouse can have hacks, etc. Or, of course, the PC environment itself and the software. And then secondly, the aspect of I suppose operating in a distributed manner. How can you, mainly taking into point latencies, how can you have a playoff between a team in Korea and a team in America when two European teams are playing together? So that's a big challenge. So we had to consider, what the rounds looked like, what the period of time they were to play, what time zones, and then ultimately when it came to the finals, how do we create the best opportunity possible to keep running, but maintain all of those integral aspects and make sure it's entertaining as much as possible. So fortunately, we were able to do that in a matter of weeks, and we were able to continue forward.
Thanks. Antonio, from the point of view of esports betting, in your observation of it over the last few months, let's say compared to last year, but also in the context of sports betting generally, what's changed for you with COVID-19?
Yeah, well, obviously, since COVID-19 struck, obviously the world saw a sort of domino effect of different sporting events all being cancelled one after the other, and that obviously created not a couple, but a lot of issues to our sports betting operators. And obviously, as a consequence, sports betting operators were looking to other sports which they may or may not usually sort of refer to in terms of offering bets on. But obviously, most operators had to look elsewhere in terms of what they need to offer. And obviously, one of those sports was of course, esports. So in terms of sports betting per se, we definitely saw a rise in esports offerings, and also on bettors betting on the esports market. Obviously, as a regulator, from the onset, we realized that there's going to be a lot of attention on esports per se. But as James rightfully noted, even the fact that obviously esports now cannot happen within arenas with other participants, etc. Even the dynamics of esports itself has changed, and that obviously affects the integrity surrounding the sport per se. So as a regulator, it was a natural approach for us to issue some recommendations to our operators, which really and truly for the esports enthusiasts, these recommendations may be, so to speak, obvious. But we need to remember that obviously these recommendations were aimed at operators, and were recommendations that they need to sort of keep in mind before offering us an esports event. For example, if you're going to offer live betting on esports, you need to make sure that the event is not pre-recorded. Another recommendation we issued was that before offering betting on an esports event, make sure to get information from the organizer itself or from reliable public information, and so on.
Yeah, thanks. It's very interesting that you mentioned the fact that if you're offering live bets, the event should be live. This will probably come as a surprise to quite a few people in the audience, that it's actually possible, and in some instances highly probable, that's not the case. Is that many games are recorded, played at a convenient time for the players, and then broadcast later at a convenient time for broadcast. And alarmingly often, there's no notice of that fact, and the broadcast is as live. So, as a casual spectator, you might believe that the game's being played in front of you. And as you know, Antonio, in terms of our, and probably Grant as well, in terms of our suspicious bet alert network, the number of ones that we've had in that actually are related to games that have already been played, where in effect we're dealing with the abuse of inside information rather than a match fix, is quite alarming, because in my previous life in traditional sport, I had never, of course, come across anything like that, because it was impossible you know, because there were human beings on a field somewhere playing a game, whereas in esports, it's a digital product, and you didn't know that. So for those of you in the audience for whom that's a surprise, keep a lookout for that, because it will definitely catch you out as an operator if you're reliable, if your data flow and your data source is not reliable. And now, Grant, what's changed for you guys at Vi?
Well, what we're seeing is, and part of it's from Vi, and part of it's from the discussions we're having with sportsbook operators that we're, as you know, we're in the process of acquiring Argyle. It's almost two different, well, not almost, it is two different scenarios. Clearly, the esport enthusiast, the traditional esport fan, those numbers of activity are definitely growing, because people are stuck at home, or forced, and not stuck, forced to be at home, and consequently they're going online more in greater numbers, more frequently, for longer periods of time. So certainly viewership is up. We are now starting to see that we've launched everything, and we're fully functional now. We're starting to see pretty substantial increases in the activity, and people signing up, making deposits, staying on the site longer. It's the more profound impact that we've seen is more from the traditional sportsbook operator. I mean, where previously 1% of their handle was on esports, and now it's 30%. And those are on the games that we were talking about earlier that are the digital representation of traditional sports. That's where they're mostly going. Some shooter games, but definitely not transferring into the league and Dota matches. I think one of the conversations and one of the topics is probably most relevant to everybody watching and everybody here is, how do you hold on to that increased traffic? Because that's really exciting, that for the first time, because I think we'd all agreed that only 3 months ago, the thought of thousands, tens of thousands of sports fans all of a sudden betting on esports, if you brought that conversation up, it would have been squashed almost immediately. And we believe that once traditional sports resumes, the vast majority of those fans will go back to watching and betting on the traditional sport. I think one thing that has to be considered by the tournament organizers of FIFA League and 2K, etc., is to try and position those tournaments and those league matches off season from the traditional games, so you can maybe have a continuity after the traditional leagues and those fans who clearly want to bet. I mean, we've all seen the numbers. It's substantial. That may be the best plan to have, to hold on to them instead of running them in tandem with the traditional season, is to run them off the season. That's what I'd like to see, certainly, and that's something for James and the organizers to work with. But no question, the numbers are up on both sides, but for different reasons. The sports fan wants to bet, and they will bet. I think it was Ian, you mentioned it on a call, that they bet on 2 flies who's going to eat the most sugar. I mean, they want to bet, so that they're going to bet. You just got to give them a product and not compete with their regular one. The esports fans, I'm hoping that this was an opportunity to see a very rapid maturation of the gambling market. The numbers are increasing. They're good. The future looks great. We've sort of accelerated what we were forecasting, 1-2 years in the future. I think it's going to happen, it's going to be 2020 numbers, which would have not happened had this crazy global pandemic taken place. So it's one of the bizarre positive events for our industry, that it's one of the positive outcomes, if you could say such a crazy thing in such an awful time. But that would be my 2 cents.
And Marek, what's your observation? What's changed at Odin over the last, say, 4 months, either projected or actual changes?
Yeah, when it comes to the current situation, we've seen definitely a lot of demand for esports solutions, either when it comes to sort of what we call core titles or sporting simulators as well. There seems to be potentially a chicken egg problem, because many of the bookmakers, they are thinking about the things that, okay, so right now the situation comes, we are going to offer esports, and this is it, and our esports is actually not growing as everybody else around is saying it can grow. And this is, if you didn't invest in the past, if you do not want to invest right now, then the question for the millennials is, okay, so why should we potentially go to this brand in particular? Why we shouldn't stuck with somebody who we've been for the last couple of years, right, or months or so? So I guess even bookmakers, they should ask themselves whether, in terms of potentially, I do not want to call it directly hedging, but midterm to long-term strategy, because we do not know yet how long this entire situation would sustain there, or whether there will be additional wave of those. Whether esports is actually something I would like to go for multiple reasons, right? To attract the younger generation, to have something in my books that can be there even if the world sort of stops to some extent, and whether I'm going to actually heavily invest in that. Because if you just go on in a way that, okay, now I have the esports offering, I'm going to improve it a bit, but it doesn't grow, so I'm not going to invest, of course you are not going to see the fruits of this endeavor.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm so conscious of the time, it's rushed past, and I do want to spend a bit of time with each of you on the way forward, because as Grant and others of you have mentioned, we've got this growth. We've definitely got a bunch of new punters, particularly on the sports simulator side. I think we've probably all got views on that, but really about the sustainability of that. How do we, as an industry, retain these guys in the esports world and in the esports betting world? What's the likely outcome? What are our plans? But before we do that, we've got a couple of questions in. The first one relates to really my area and Antonio's, and that is about something that Marek mentioned in his original presentation, where we're looking at different markets, and particularly in live play, where you've got sub-markets like who will win round one, or who will win map one of a 3-map contest, or whatever, And Connie had asked, do you have concerns about spot fixing? And the answer is very much yes. But I've had those concerns for a long, long time. I would say the majority of our suspicious bet alerts these days relate to spot fixing rather than match fixing. So fixing certain outcomes within the game rather than the result of the whole game. I would say these days that's more than 50% of the investigations that we're involved in match fixing are spot fixing investigations. But that hasn't really changed in any particular way from prior to COVID-19. It's much the same. What has changed is volume. Anecdotally, because my operations assistant is busy, who runs our intelligence database and is a former detective herself, is currently doing the analysis of this. But my anecdotal guess is that we've had about, I would say since the beginning of February, middle of February, about a 50% increase in the number of suspicious bet alerts. But a lot of those relate to games and outcomes and tournaments that didn't exist prior to COVID-19. I mean, of course the games existed, but I mean the interest in those games and the betting on those games didn't exist, in particular the sports simulators. And I'll just throw Antonio that particular question. Your concerns about spot fixing within esports, are they any different to your concerns within traditional sport?
Yeah, good question. To be honest, I completely agree with what you said, Ian, that the biggest difference was in terms of volume rather than risks per se. And I think from a regulatory perspective, the best example that I can give is the fact that the rise in volume within esports, we saw that also in terms of suspicious bets with other sports which were still being allowed to play due to the COVID-19. And these were more individualistic sports, such as we're speaking about table tennis, darts. These are the kind of sports that obviously the restrictive measures with respect to COVID-19 did not impact them that much. So even in terms of suspicious betting, which obviously increased in proportion of the volume which esports attracted, this was also the case with other sports also. And that is why in the beginning I said that it's not fair that one should allow this COVID-19 period sort of put a black spot on esports, because when it comes to people with ill intent who are betting with ill intent, this is not just the case in esports, but in any other sports, also. What, in my opinion, is the biggest difference between esports and other sports is the way esports is governed. And I think as a way forward, within that context, all stakeholders need to pitch in, realize the risks, and as a way forward, try and suggest measures which can obviously minimize those risks which are earmarked. But sort of to conclude on this, I completely agree with you, Ian. So with respect to with regards to spot fixing per se, I mean, the risk per se did not change. In terms of suspicious betting per se, yes, they did increase, but obviously they increased because, as we said, the volumes are now much higher.
Yes, unfortunately, because esports is largely the only show in town, we've attracted all those guys who were fixing tennis and football and everything else prior to that, and because we're the only guys around now, they've switched their attention to esports. It's very, very irritating. But and you're right, there is a massive gap in governance, and one of the big surprises for me has been the lack of interest in the integrity of their competition shown by the traditional sports governing bodies who've leapt on the esports bandwagon in the absence of their sport. And I'm talking right from the top, you know, FIFA, UEFA, NBA. It's almost as if integrity of their esports competitions has been the absolute bottom of their priority list. And that really surprised me, because in traditional sport on the field, it's quite high in their list of priorities, but they've been in such a rush to get the esports offering out that they've given this very little thought.
The interesting thing about that, Ian, is that you know, while the traditional sports IP started to adopt esports as a prospect, you know, apart from the ones that obviously use their own talent base, players or drivers or whatever, they kind of approach the market in a very naive manner in many respects, and I think it's more for a lack of understanding that we experienced throughout this time, where, you know, the implications of you know, the details around potential cheating, integrity propositions or options, but also you know, what are the flip side purpose. And I think this leads into the longevity of this activity. Like, how will this continue on beyond a lockdown situation? Well, the reality is, I think if you look at some of the IPs, they're not quite understood the true purpose or the true cause or the true opportunity that they've landed on with this. And you know, what we're hoping to get out of this situation is a heightened level of market confidence. So effectively, you know, now that we've kind of waved a flag from an esports perspective to, you know, the powers that be, like executives, chairmen, you know, who haven't probably played a game in their life, now will give it at least enough attention to allow for the kind of professional aspect of the business to shine through. And I think in a situation where many businesses are in effect reducing their overheads in a preservative manner, you know, that opportunity sort of sails by and opens up opportunities to people who are just looking for foul play or a quick win. So I really do hope that you know, the industry at large will learn from what we've gone through and try and iterate for a longer term vision, really.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think it probably came as a massive surprise to the people within these traditional sports governing bodies that people bet on esports. I don't think it even crossed their mind that happened. because they think it's full of fat kids playing video games in a dark basement, and the reality of our world is not one that they know. Guys, one more question. We've got two more questions. I hope we got a minute if we can give some brief answers to this. But the one is, I hope quite a quick one, is how should, and this comes from Dan Spencer, how should the esports betting industry be looking after the young and vulnerable new customers that have turned to esports during this time? This is a responsible gambling question. And I guess, my immediate response would be the license regimes that solve these problems through age verification and various other safe measures. But Grant, what would you say to that?
Well, this is coming up more and more all the time, of course, because in certain titles, the age does track lower. There's no question. The fan base of the players is lower. But I think we can all agree that if we look at traditional sports, there's a lot of underage players in the NCAA. And if anybody's ever been to a casino with a sports book during March Madness, the gambling is rampant. Right? I mean, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of wagering. This is no different. I mean, as long as you've got the policies in place, it doesn't matter if they're watching. As long as you've got the integrity in there to do the age verification, it really is. It's already there in the system. It just depends on dealing with an operator who's going to follow the rules. Some don't, as we know. There are unlicensed operators, and then there's regulated ones that have. Like in our case, Overwatch, the SEC, and gaming commissions. And I would suggest if that is everybody's big concern, then hopefully the fans and the players will deal with the credible operators. The system's already in place. And one of your questions earlier, it's not that the regulatory bodies don't want to manage suspicious activity. It's just that this happened so quickly. It was a radical change. And of course, when you have radical change, a little bit of chaos ensues, and we're just sort of getting through that process. I mean, who would have imagined network television would be broadcasting NBA 2K 90 days ago? If you'd have said that during the NBA playoff season, everybody just told you you're mad. And yet that's a regular event now. So,
yep.
The structure hasn't caught up to the reality just yet.
Yeah,
maybe
I think that's right. And unfortunately, we've got at least two more really nice questions here from Judy Tate, Jamie Lewis. I don't think we're going to get to them, but hopefully what I'm going to ask each of you to do, starting with Marek, is look in your crystal ball and tell me what's the way forward for esports betting here from your point of view. How can we maximize this inadvertent opportunity that our industry's been thrown? And also, of course, to say goodbye to our lovely audience, because we've got literally 8 minutes left before we've taken up the full hour. So starting with you, Marek.
Yeah, when it comes to crystal ball, it's of course hard to predict anything, but at the same time, if you look at the recent trends, it's not like FIFA might come and go, but when it comes to core titles, the momentum has been building for quite some time. We are not speaking, even when it comes to AGs, Dota, League of Legends, CSGO, they are titles that have more than 10 years of history already. They have followers. There might be more people coming to the age where they can enjoy the entertainment of betting. So potentially there might be waves of incoming players that will be allowed to bet under the umbrella of safe gambling. With this being said, esports has a bright future for sure. The younger generations are fully digital. If you go by bus, if you go by train, if you can, not right now, but potentially, but you would hear the young generation to speak about ninjas, about the influencers within the esports. Even now, right, I'm mixing esports and gaming. They would be speaking about these personas. They would not be speaking potentially about Messi, about Ronaldo. This is the old generation, or mid-generation as I am. But at the same time, this being said, of course, they would watch these titles, they would want to be entertained, and part of that would come betting and gambling as well. So within 5 to 10 years, we might be really speaking and looking at esports being it's already being in top 5 for multiple operators that did invest into esports. So we might be speaking at and looking at top 3 titles, potentially top 2. But I guess as the time goes, we would not be speaking about esports in a sense of a specific sport. But similarly, as we do not speak about ball sports and mixing football with volleyball, with golf and others, we will be speaking and distinguishing each of them. So there is definitely a bright future for esports, and across the different geographies, this would mean different stars to be shine, either CSGO for CIS, Dota 2 for SEA, or potentially Valorant for the UK. We'll see.
Yeah, cool. Antonio, your crystal ball.
Yeah, obviously my personal opinion is that obviously esports was already on a gradual positive rise. Obviously, the COVID-19 situation sort of escalated that. As Grant did note, when traditional sports will resume, probably the esports industry will lose betters, but we need to keep in mind that many will remain. And as we said, this occurred due to the COVID-19 situation, so that increase in number is a sort of bonus number, which is added to the already gradual positive rise which was happening in esports. Obviously, in terms of maintaining this steady rise, I think integrity plays a big part in that also. And this obviously is the case with any other sport also, because if a sport lacks integrity, then obviously bettors will start shying off from betting in that sport. So as a way forward, and as I said before, it is important that all stakeholders, and not just regulatory bodies, all stakeholders need to realize the risks which are involved in esports and propose ways forward on how to mitigate those risks. We, as an MGA, we are trying to play our part in that. But as I said, unless there's going to be a collaborative approach to this, as a regulatory body alone, we're very limited to what we can do. But just to summarize it in one single line, I think that the future of esports is very bright, very bright.
Thank you, James. Your thoughts? What's happening?
I think I'm going to talk on the B2B side mainly. I think the industry, well, overall, the industry is getting a lot more attention during this time. We've also been able to iterate with various sort of technologies, challenge our status quo in the operational side of things. So I think as there is a heightened market confidence in making some commitments and investments into the esports industry as a whole, I think longer term we will see a fairly accelerated approach to some of the, I guess, areas of professionalization of the industry, but also I think there'll be heightened interest in, I suppose, revaluing the property. So if you're to compare a lot of the esports properties out there, they're relatively low cost, if you like, compared to some of the traditional sports IPs. I think a lot of companies and partners will consider the prospect of another disruptive situation in the future. I think we should never rule that out, and therefore esports should become very much part of their strategy if it fits. And then obviously how that's properly valued and how effectively that will accelerate the growth of the entire industry.
Yeah,
so positive.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Grant, we've got 2 minutes.
Well, clearly there's been a huge increase in awareness. It's been cast onto the main stage. All the big stakeholders, all the big sporting organizations have taken notice. TV networks, etc. So I think being able to, it's not going to reset to pre-COVID. That's not going to happen. A lot of the new awareness is there. That's going to stick. There does have to be some thinking about how to maintain those, digital sports punters that are traditional bettors how to maintain that, keep that traffic. We saw the same thing when online gambling started back in the 90s. It was a mature market, but they didn't like putting credit cards and information online. It took 10 years for that really to become a viable business. Here, everybody likes information online, no problem. Using credit cards and various payment methods to bet, that's taken some time to mature. And I think that this COVID pandemic has accelerated that timeline. What would have been 10 years, I think we're going to see a lot of profitable operations, a lot of people taking, making bets and wagers that maybe would have been 5 years. It's going to be a shorter time horizon. I don't know. My crystal ball is broken. I don't know if it's going to be 5 years or 3 years, but we're going to get there. And those of us on this screen, we're obviously all in here for the long game.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks very much. And I think one of the messages here is think slow but act fast. We're in a period of amazing opportunity. None of us had factored this in to our business plans, but I think overall we have a positive opportunity, and in particular all of our opportunity outside of our business, but also in our lives, to shape the new normal rather than being passive acceptors of whatever it turns out to be. Let's make sure it suits us. Thanks very much, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Thank you.
That definitely was a fascinating panel. Just a quick reminder to the audience, the webinar will be available to watch back tomorrow on the IGB website. And again, thank you for signing on to watch. Thanks to our amazing panel and our sponsors, Odin, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks. Thank you.